Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, and I am going to be very brief because you're not here to see me, you're here to see the students. I'm simply going to call out their names and they will go in the order that is listed on the flyer. I'm Val Littlefield, Director of African American Studies, and I have had the pleasure of working with these students for about a year now. And they're more than ready to share with you some of the things that they found out. Brian Robinson, PhD candidate, Department of History. Tyler Perry actually has his PhD, he just needs the hoodie. Robert Green II, PhD candidate, History. Chanel McCain, who will graduate in May. Sean Pitt, who is an exchange student. Holly Genovese, MA student, History. Ramon Jackson, PhD student, who's so close to graduating that he's another Tyler. Tamara McCrae, an undergraduate student who will also graduate this year. So please join me in welcoming these students. And I have the hook.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Robinson, PhD candidate, Department of History. The title of my presentation is Found and Lost, Reconsidering Education and Culture in South Carolina. The most controversial acts of the 1868 Constitution were voting, taxing, collecting debt, and education. I am examining or re-examining why the educational components were so problematic, particularly Section 4, 3, and 4 concerning mixed schools and compulsory attendance. The Daily Phoenix, commenting on the Constitution in regard to mixed schools and compulsory education, stated, "No one who has regards for any morals, manners, or future respectability of his children will tolerate mixed schools. The compulsory system may suit the genius of the tyrannical government like Prussia, but it is at war with the spirit of our free institutions. At least a parent should be permitted in a free Republican government to govern his household and determine for himself what is best for him to do. There seems to be a studied design throughout all the provisions of this most infamous Constitution to degrade the white race and elevate the black race, to force upon us social as well as political equality and bring about the mixture of races." The Edgefield newspaper followed up, stating, "If the reigning government of South Carolina thinks that it can force social equality upon the whites of the state, it is vastly mistaken. The laws of God and of nature cannot be changed or abrogated by the edicts of the carpetbag administration. In regards to mixed schools, when the colored man enters, the whites retire. Wherever they are attempted, harm will come of the experiment. The whites will not tolerate it, the blacks do not desire them." At first glimpse, one would argue that the goal of mixed schools was integration. But as some historians have begun to discover, that racially integrated schools was not the intended purposes of opening schools without regard to race, but to allow choice and the right to attend any school and prevent discrimination. So how can we understand some of the early intentions of desegregation or integration? I think when we examine the words and the comments of the leaders of the Constitution and the historiography of Reconstruction, we realize that integration was not the fundamental goal of opening schools to all children regardless of race, but a strategy to establish humane interactions between whites and blacks. Education was essential to not only the South's educational problems, but also challenging the culture of racial prejudice and unfair treatment. Free education for all was the second step in this process of obtaining fair treatment. It is a more hostile step. Through the possibility of integrated schools, equal treatment would be required rather than willingly exchanged. Open schools provided entry into the white sphere without invitation. This hostile approach is another way to characterize Reconstruction, the 1868 Constitution, particularly the acts that would allow mixed schools and compulsory attendance, and the Federal Reconstruction Amendments. Moreover, the rejection of this entry by blacks into the white sphere is another way to understand the Redemption Campaign, the Mississippi Plan, the Ku Klux Klan, Plessy versus Ferguson, lynching, rape, racial etiquette, Jim Crow, and general hostility between whites and blacks. Civil rights versus states' rights were not battles that only reflect white versus black. It was interest versus treatment, comfort versus discomfort, fear versus ideology, revenge versus confusion, risk versus desire, truth versus imagination, mind versus reality. By focusing on the discussion that surrounds education during Reconstruction, this project seeks to examine human elements of Reconstruction. By human element, I mean contradictions, selfishness, fears, ideologies, and confusions that the historical actors portrayed or did not portray. I believe I can show how fickle humans really are. What they say is not always what they mean. What they mean is not always what they say. And sometimes what they mean is what they say. What they do is not always what they intend. And what they intend is not always what happened. In other words, I want to come to grips with what seem to be historical contradictions to the present mind, but how the ideology of the past made sense to the historical actors. For instance, in the case of education during Reconstruction, blacks were very assertive in obtaining the opportunity to be educated. We know this because of the desire of many blacks to read and write during slavery, which the historical record confirms. But I contend that the black assertiveness for education was not just the desire held over from slavery, but it was a critique of the Old South. The injustice towards blacks, and I hope to show the injustice towards lower-class whites as well. I hope to show that blacks as well as lower-class whites have long been troubled by the inequalities in regards to education, knowledge, power, and resources. The use of the state to establish public education is something historians would and have described as a progressive program. I think we need to see the growth in the use of the state in a very peculiar manner. I hope to show that the problem with Reconstruction government was not only that blacks were in office, but the different conception and the practice of an unfamiliar republicanism that manifested from Republican rule. Accused of being a socialist and communist program, the Reconstruction government no doubt demonstrated a very different side of the state government when it is not operated by elite planners. In 1872, before Owensboro survivors, John Hamilton stated in regards to the Republican government of South Carolina, and I quote, "Here already burned the fierce fires of socialism, more relentless than Indian savagery, that knowing no higher law than self would uproot civil rule. Expanding the government to benefit another class of people was a very radical idea. The government has long backed the interests of the wealthy. However, free education was a program that was intended to benefit the masses. Nevertheless, the ideas of mixed schools demonstrated that Southern culture was out of place. Despite evidence that neither blacks nor white Republicans sought to force whites and blacks into the same school, it was the imagination, fears, and fantasies of whites which they used to argue the contrary and build a collective thought concerning the evils of Reconstruction. It is now known that part of the idea behind mixed-race schools was the belief that education could subdue the power of racial prejudice. It is not that Reconstruction officials believed mixed schools would dominate the landscape, but they believed that free schools open to all would debunk the claims of black inferiority, demonstrate equal intellectual capacity, and prevent imbalanced funding, as well as construct the atmosphere of race relations that was satisfactory to all. The forward thinking of these politicians in regards to dealing with the psychology of whites through equal opportunity reveals not only the influence of education, but the power of ideas, interaction, and access. The University of South Carolina is important to the story of Reconstruction. Joel Williamson noted that whites were so bent on not losing the university that the Citadel was offered as a place to educate blacks. There was a great desire to keep the University of South Carolina an all-white institution. The need to have the university remain all-white represented the ideological placement of the university as a symbol of white supremacy, home rule, and unadulterated Southern culture. The News and Herald noted, South Carolina will not fully realize that she again is herself until the old South Carolina College is once more safely in the hands of whites of the state. The admission of black students, faculty, staff furthered the aims of the Reconstruction resistance camp. The university opened its doors to blacks served to fuel the redemption campaign. Furthermore, the regaining of the state and the closing of the university served as a victory of the redemption government. The New York Times noted the Democratic legislature of South Carolina intended from the first to do away with what has been called the nigger university, and in this, they have succeeded. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending. My name is Tyler Perry, recent PhD of the Department of History. Very much appreciated. On December 26, 1873, Simon P. Smith, a student of Howard University, responded to a letter from his friend Reverend E. F. Williams, who announced the news that South Carolina, the state of Smith's birth, had desegregated its flagship university. Such news was an emotional moment for Smith, as he was once a slave upon that same campus, waiting upon the white students who attained an education he was legally denied. He was told that students from Howard were being recruited to help bolster the talent of the newly desegregated university, and he responded with exultation, quote, "I would very much like to go to South Carolina College. There I understand that I shall not have to pay tuition or room rent. I would like to go there and finish my schooling because I am a South Carolinian and was brought up in Columbia. When quite a small boy, I used to wait on Southern students in that college, and I remember once standing in the door of one of the buildings and cried because I could not go to school. Now, thank God, there has been a great change. The mountains have been brought low, and the valleys are exalted." Despite his jubilation, Smith remained at Howard to finish his education, but his quote encompasses the essence of this presentation in its focus upon how individuals throughout the state reacted to the news of the university's desegregation and assess how the students performed while they attended. As Smith stated in his letter, the goal of what scholars now call the radical experiment was to provide opportunities for students who were historically disbarred from entrance to the university by providing scholarships that would pay tuition and lodging. The lion's share of students who took advantage of the government program were former slaves. This subversion of the former system, motivated by the Constitution of 1868 that Brian Robinson has just explained, represented the most harrowing nightmare for white elites who held nostalgia for the former Confederacy. While most of these students were unable to finish their higher education at USC due to the change in government in 1877, many of them attained remarkable accomplishments later in their lives. A primary worry of white elites after 1868 was the suspected takeover of public education throughout the state. Providing education to the masses was a socio-political maneuver that provided men in South Carolina the equal opportunity to obtain publicly sanctioned education regardless of color. While it would take 5 years from the Constitution's passage before the first black student, Henry E. Hayne, to enroll in the university and effectively destroy the racial exclusivity that defined the antebellum institution, white South Carolinians previously suspected the enrollment of blacks was inevitable and, perhaps unsurprisingly, believed it would bring about disastrous consequences. One critic, named James E. Pike, held the following expectations for students of color as he mused over it in 1872. Quote, "The movement will eventuate in the substantial destruction of the university, as the black population will afford an inadequate supply of students. It is a damaging blow to the interests of education in the state, and a significant step in the process of Africanization. But even if college could be allowed to remain in the hands of the whites, such is their strict condition, that it would be difficult to maintain its former prosperity." Such was the general expectation, and Henry Haynes' enrollment in the university's medical school triggered reactions from the white community that were vituperative as well as destructive. Upon his enrollment, one white student defaced the registration book prior to exiting the university, and the remaining antebellum faculty members resigned soon after. While this maneuver shook the foundations of the old order, it was not just a local issue. Various newspapers throughout the nation reported upon the action. As far away as Mower County, Minnesota, one report stated, quote, "A telegram from Columbia, South Carolina claims that the colored Secretary of State, Hayne, has been admitted as a student in the South Carolina University. 3 of the principal professors have resigned in consequence," unquote. Thus, Hayne set off a firestorm of white flight that eventually saw the university hold a decisive black majority throughout the duration of the radical experiment. While there is no actual evidence that Hayne ever attended a class, it seems his enrollment was a strategic political tactic designed to upend the status quo. Indeed, Hayne was no stranger to such controversy. As a freeborn child of mixed parentage, Hayne was able to pass for white throughout most of his life. But it seems he did so with the ultimate goal that he could use his position to promote racial progress. During the Civil War, for instance, Hayne used his racial ambiguity to first enlist in the Confederate Army, with plans to defect to the Union. And at the first opportunity, Hayne enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers Regiment, a Union contingent comprised predominantly of escaped slaves. After the Civil War, Hayne was vigorously active in South Carolina's Reconstruction politics and was elected as a state senator from 1868 to 1872. During Hayne's tenure as senator, he gained national exposure for controversial activities. In 1871, Hayne intentionally attempted to take communion at a mission church alongside the white members, causing the mission to be suspended immediately after the event. In 1872, Hayne was elected Secretary of State in South Carolina until Reconstruction ended in 1877. Other students that enrolled in the university also demonstrated exceptional talent, so much so that Booker T. Washington lauded the men of, quote, that famous class of 1874, which furnished 1 Negro congressman, 2 United States ministers to Liberia, 5 doctors, 7 preachers, and several businessmen who have made good in their life, unquote. In the racially charged atmosphere of the postbellum South, for black men to achieve such stellar accolades was no small feat. Henry H. Hurd, for instance, went on to be a diplomat in Liberia and reflected that the stipend provided by the university allowed him to obtain his education as well as support his family. Next slide. Reverend Henry H. Pinckney earned a doctorate of divinity, built churches throughout the Northeast, became a presiding elder in the AME Church, and wrote 1 book that examined the Old Testament prophet Zechariah. Richard T. Greener, arguably the most distinguished pupil, is most well known as professor in the classics department, teaching courses on metaphysics and logic as well as Latin and Greek. During radical Reconstruction, however, Greener also obtained a degree in law and taught classes on international law and the Constitution at the university. Greener also became particularly well known for rearranging an extraordinary 30,000 volumes held by the university library to both preserve and make them more available for the students. In one final example, we have Reverend George T. Clinton, who Booker T. Washington called, quote, one of the most distinguished black men of my race, unquote. Clinton was an activist, scholar, and writer who formed churches, represented the AME both domestically and abroad, and edited multiple publications produced by the AME Church. Reflecting upon these achievements, it appears evident that the university lost an opportunity to produce a powerful alumni that was comprised of talented individuals whose influence were not only regional but transnational. While historians are often nervous to ask counterfactual questions that journey down the long, twisted roads of hypothetical speculation, this research has prompted me to ask a compelling question. How did this black brain drain contribute to the possible destruction of the university? For all of their talk about the university losing its prestige at the admittance of black students, those who sought to preserve the racial hierarchy were blind to the fact that the radical university was actually capable of producing high-caliber students. Unfortunately, the doctrine of racial exclusivity overruled practicality, and the fight was left to future generations of civil rights activists who are among us today, who chipped away at the racial hierarchy throughout the 20th century, culminating in the university's eventual re-desegregation in 1963. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Green II, and the title of my paper is Before 1963, African Americans, USC, and the Battle to Desegregate Southern Universities. In 1938, at the height of the New Deal era, a curious event occurred at the University of South Carolina's law school. That year, Charles Bailey applied to the law school in Columbia. His application, which would normally have been of no concern to anyone beyond the registrar, sent waves of fear and apprehension throughout the South. As you can probably guess, Mr. Bailey was African American. And in this political and social climate, an African American man applying for law school in the Deep South was nothing less than cause for alarm. Before 1963, attempts to link the desegregation of USC in 1963 with the travails of students in the 1870s and the activism across the country against racism in the early 20th century. For African Americans in the state of South Carolina, it was never a question of if USC would be integrated. Instead, it was only a matter of patience, strategy, and determination. before black students would resume their rightful position in the classrooms of the University of South Carolina. By the late 1930s, African Americans across the nation joined the battle to desegregate a wide variety of American institutions. Despite the devastation of the Great Depression, many resources were still spared by African Americans to fight against racism all over the nation. In 1936, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, already made some great strides in university segregation. That year, 1936, Donald Murray won acceptance to the University of Maryland Law School after the State Court of Appeals upheld the decision to allow him there. It seemed that between this, attempts at don't buy where you can't work campaigns, and a new visibility of African Americans in the White House and elsewhere in Washington, D.C., new movement on the civil rights front was on the horizon, as Charles Hamilton Houston, leading NAACP lawyer, said in 1935, quote, "The first signs of a mass movement are beginning to appear," end quote. Various battles over higher education desegregation began to take place in South Carolina in the late 1930s. As I mentioned before, Charles Bailey was only one of several African Americans who challenged South Carolina's segregated higher education system. In some sense, there were two potential outcomes that could benefit African Americans, such as Bailey and others in South Carolina. Option number one included the possibility of a scholarship for Bailey to attend a law school outside of South Carolina. Some states, such as Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Virginia, and Tennessee, already allowed this option. The second option, however, was even better. This is what they're really looking for. The return, after over 60 years of absence, of African Americans as students to USC. White political and social leaders in South Carolina were well aware of the challenges being mounted by the NAACP to desegregate across the nation. USC's own president, McKissick, commented in 1938 that, quote, "A nationwide movement was begun by Negroes to force equal opportunities with whites in higher education," end quote. Concern over the possibility that USC might be forced to integrate led to the South Carolina legislature passing a bill to create a new black-only law school at South Carolina State University, South Carolina State College in Orangeburg. The initiative that black activists held in the potential acceptance of Bailey, or at least the integration of a new black law school, languished, however, for several years. Eventually, by 1941, the NAACP found itself unable to continue the fight on behalf of Bailey. A young man willing to fight for acceptance to USC, Bailey himself was surprised and a bit disappointed by the NAACP's inability to continue the case. So again, you want to think about the fact that NAACP is fighting on a wide variety of fronts, not just in South Carolina, but all over the nation. The lesson I've just discussed is key if we're to understand the events of 1963. As my fellow panel members, Brian and Tyler have already commented, there was a history of African American students at USC during the Reconstruction era. In addition, during the 1930s, the NAACP demonstrated it was willing to fight across the South for the right of well-educated African Americans to attend professional and law schools, or at the very least, for southern states to create new graduate schools expressly for the purpose of educating black students. The stage had already been set for events to unfold in the late 1950s and early 1960s that would lead to 3 African American students registering at USC on September 11, 1963. Now, the immediate post-World War II period provided another chance for the NAACP to desegregate the University of South Carolina. In a political environment that featured a double V campaign during the war itself, a victory against fascism abroad and against racism at home, African Americans were more determined than ever to break Jim Crow. Of course, many white Southerners were just as determined to uphold the racial and cultural traditions of the South, no matter the cost. Enter John Wrighton, a black student in the state of South Carolina who would apply to the USC Law School in 1946. Wrighton was only one of hundreds of African Americans who, after the Second World War, attempted to desegregate graduate schools in the South. In NAACP, their efforts were revived by the rising tide of college-educated black men and women attempting to obtain more and better education across the South and across the nation, supported his case. However, the 1947 decision by Judge Waring was, at best, ambivalent in regards to the future of the desegregation of USC and other schools in South Carolina. He ruled in Wrighton versus Board of Trustees that South Carolina merely had to provide a law school for African American students, not necessarily that the school itself here at USC had to be desegregated. However, there was a caveat, a potential opening for black students in the future. If South Carolina failed to provide this law school as a state, then Waring's words, quote, The plaintiff will be entitled to entrance at the law school of the university, unquote. In other words, if the school isn't provided for African-American students, at some point they may have to desegregate the law school and by extension the graduate school and the university itself. The new law school for African Americans in South Carolina presented a new opportunity, but it also presented a new problem. Should blacks be content with simply having their own school? History had shown, after all, that despite the lip service of, quote, separate but equal, unquote, many Southern attempts at education for African Americans that were state funded often failed to provide an equal education and equal opportunity for African Americans. Officials in the NAACP weren't so sure that black-only law schools were the best opportunity for up-and-coming black professionals. Here, again, we must reflect upon the fact that African Americans in South Carolina and indeed across the nation were always confronted with both opportunities and possible pitfalls. It reminds us that history is always full of other possibilities, as Tyler has already mentioned. Such possibilities, in this case, were being pushed on the ground in South Carolina by young African American college students who were also impatient with the current system in the state. In the early 1950s, as was the case in the late 30s and throughout the 1940s, was a time of peril for most white Southern leaders. Across the South, concern about the NAACP offensive on the issue of school desegregation gave rise to another manifestation of a classic concern about black political and social power finally making headway. For example, the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary wrote a letter to President Norman Smith to say that they were considering admission of some qualified Negro graduate students. In reply, President Smith said that, quote, once one Negro was accepted in the door, was accepted, the door could not be closed to other applicants, end quote. In other words, many Southerners, whites and black, knew and understood the stakes of what would happen if just one African American student entered USC. Now, students at Allen University, a black college also located here in Columbia, were certainly also aware of those stakes. In January of 1958, 11 students from Allen would apply at USC. Again, the conflict over segregation and power in the state was at the heart of the decision to apply. Allen's loss of accreditation for its teacher training efforts, the byproduct of Allen's students being pushed by some of their professors to protest segregation in Columbia, led to black students asking a simple but very important question. How were they supposed to teach the next generation of African American students without accreditation for one of the black colleges in the state? The NAACP, caught off guard by the actions of the students and still stretched thin, fighting for desegregation across the country in a post-Brown v. Board of Education country, couldn't quite offer the support needed to the students in their efforts to desegregate USC. However, at this point, the tide was slowly beginning to turn in favor of African American students across the country. Now, in the early 1960s, you'd see universities of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi desegregated, albeit with plenty of violence under many Americans. By the fall of 1963, Clemson, that school north, was also desegregating, and it appeared it was time for USC to do the same. But it must be noted in closing that this critical moment in South Carolina's history did not occur just because it was the right time. Instead, the events of the preceding 25 years, and I would add going back to the 1870s, put increasing pressure on the state, with white Southern leaders constantly kept under pressure and African Americans clinging to the hope that, like their recently freed ancestors in the 1870s, they could finally gain the kind of education that they could only receive at the University of South Carolina. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Chanel McCain, and I'm a senior in political science and African American studies double major at USC. My presentation is titled, The Second Desegregation of USC. Columbia is not Oxford, and South Carolina is not Mississippi. In a letter to Henri Monteith on December 5, 1962, USC graduate student Hayes Mizell wrote, quote, "You will be interested to know that there are now groups and individuals on the Carolina campus who are working to effect an atmosphere of moderation and reason among the members of the student body. South Carolina is not Mississippi. There's every indication that Columbia will not become another Oxford," end quote. So let's put this into historical context. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously declared in Brown v. Board of Education that, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." This statement concluded an intense legal fight by Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and other NAACP lawyers. However, this doctrine was met with staunch resistance by legislators in many southern states. In Mississippi, the contentions came to a head when Ole Miss and black applicant James Meredith endured an intense legal battle regarding Meredith's admission in 1962. In Russell Barrett's work, Integration at Ole Miss, the author explains how the school's administration attempted to develop a course of action that was focused on student leaders promoting and attempting to maintain law and order. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, however, undermined the student body's efforts by igniting violent rhetoric surrounding Meredith's admission and proclaimed, quote, "No school will be integrated while I am your governor," end quote. Barnett's rhetoric essentially laid the foundation for what Barrett calls a blueprint for riot. On Sunday, September 30th, violence and chaos erupted on the campus of Ole Miss. Barrett determines that many of the people wreaking havoc were not even students or had any affiliation with the university. They were outsiders. The mob vandalized vehicles and buildings. They attacked reporters, faculty members, and U.S. Marshals. At the end of it all, 2 lives were lost and many more injured. Due to widespread news coverage surrounding the desegregation of the University of Mississippi, people around the world witnessed the lengths that people would go to maintain the status quo. Students in the yet-to-be-desegregated University of South Carolina reacted with disappointment and a determination to prevent that from happening here. On October 14, 1962, a typewritten letter from Dan Carter to Hayes Mizell contained a short yet powerful message referencing the situation at Ole Miss. Quote, "I'll tell you, I've lost several nights of sleep over this thing. Honestly, I even considered leaving school and going back to South Carolina doing something, anything to try to stop that from happening there," end quote. South Carolina had still not desegregated its public schools and colleges, and a cloud of inevitability had loomed in the Palmetto State. As a student already sympathetic to civil rights, Dan Carter met and shared an apartment with fellow graduate students in history, Hayes Mizell, Charles Joyner, and Selden Smith. They were all white students from the University of South Carolina with a passion for doing the right thing. Together, they formed a coalition among South Carolina's black and white students, which was determined to facilitate the peaceful desegregation of South Carolina's colleges. The organization was known as the Student Council Wing of the South Carolina Council on Human Relations. As Mr. Robert Greene mentioned before, these were the people carrying out the grassroots activism. Student Council elected Charles Joyner as the first president, mostly because of his talent playing the guitar and knowledge of many freedom songs. Carter recalls many conferences, meetings, and workshops around the South, many of which had to be conducted secretly. Quote, "It is difficult to recall how daring we felt when we assembled, black and white, to plan for a day when segregation would be only a bitter memory." Mizell and Joyner eventually lost teaching assistantship positions at the University of South Carolina, possibly due to administrative backlash due to their roles in the movement. Members of the South Carolina legislature warned that radical students would be expelled for challenging segregation. In addition to involvement in the Student Council, Jack Bass, an editor of the student newspaper The Gamecock, wrote editorials condemning segregation. Mizell and other students active in the Student Council created an organization on campus called the Student Committee to Observe Order and Peace, or SCOOP. The mission statement of the group read that it was, quote, "established for the sole purpose of promoting the peaceful observance of any future court decisions," end quote, in regard to desegregation. The time finally presented itself in October of 1962 when Columbia native Henri Monteith filed suit to be admitted to the University of South Carolina. While Monteith was deliberating upon her decision, the situation at the University of Mississippi was at the forefront of the desegregation narrative in America. Gamecock covered this unrest, and editor Joan Walcott wrote an editorial in which she hoped that students would be civil and rational if desegregation was to occur. In the aforementioned letter to Monteith, Mizell invoked the missions of SCOOP and the Student Council in his purpose for writing the letter. Fortunately, not all students shared Mizell's and Walcott's view on desegregation. In May of 1963, student protesters even burned a cross in front of the president's home. Unlike the student leaders at Ole Miss, however, those at the University of South Carolina took a more responsible approach. Student body president Todd Wilson wrote that although integration was undesirable, they had a duty to maintain dignity and integrity. On July 10, 1963, the court ordered the university to admit Monteith, and within the next couple of weeks, 2 other African Americans, Robert Anderson and James Solomon, applied for admission. All 3 would be admitted in the fall. There was some backlash, but they were generally isolated incidences. Henri Monteith recalls being calm and confident throughout the entire ordeal. She was not personally met with much backlash from white people, and if she did experience racism or animosity, she ignored it. Her philosophy was, quote, "If people hurled epithets, I didn't hear it. They were going in another direction. I was going forward," end quote. After filing suit, she was met with support and kindness from many students at the university, especially ones involved with the student council. Just as the students predicted, the enrollment and registration of Henri Monteith, Robert Anderson, and James Solomon at the University of South Carolina could not have been more unlike the debacle that occurred at the University of Mississippi. On September 11, 1963, the trio arrived on campus and registered for classes without incident. Monteith was later told that in an address to reporters on the day of registration, she stated, quote, "We will not be Mississippi, we will not have violence. If that's what you came to see, won't be here," end quote. South Carolina avoided desegregation for almost a decade after Brown v. Board of Education, but its delay could have contributed to the nonviolent transition at the University of South Carolina. The university administration and the student body had time to prepare and shape the rhetoric surrounding desegregation, which they hoped would ensure a peaceful process. Henri Monteith processes the outcome by saying, "It didn't happen by chance." She credits the South Carolina Council on Human Relations and its student council as being a great organization to mobilize and prepare people for desegregation.
Good afternoon, my name is Sean Pitt and I'm an exchange student from England and chose to call my project "From Desegregation to Integration, Early Race Relations at the University of South Carolina." When researching for my paper, I found the inspiration for the title on the USC desegregation website, which made a distinction between the ideas of desegregation and integration. There is a tendency to oversimplify the issue by putting both words under the same banner or meaning, but this is of course inaccurate. My paper is based on attempting to give insight into race relations at USC in the years immediately following desegregation in 1963. While desegregation relates to the enactment of a law prohibiting, in this case, a university from refusing admission based on race, integration is far more related to the mindset and prevailing attitudes of the citizens in question and how they put these attitudes into action. Once a legal ruling has been made, segregation can be ended in an instant, but integration takes time to evolve and gather momentum. Events of 50 years ago marked the end of one process and the beginning of another. The courts had spoken, the ruling had been made, and segregation at USC was over. However, in many ways, 1963 was the beginning of the integration process. One interesting point I gathered from my research was that the general consensus appears to be that the student body was far more accepting of the changes than the university administration. This perhaps reflects the social revolution of the 1960s. However, this is not to say that the student body was entirely tolerant, as the recollections of Robert Anderson included several harrowing instances of racism. To get a greater understanding of how the desegregation of USC may have been received, I have also researched race relations city and statewide in the early 1960s. Despite being a relative latecomer to the civil rights movement, by this time peaceful protests were well underway in Columbia, and a significant court ruling had been made the previous year to desegregate the city's lunch counters. Although it may well have been orchestrated and there was significant security presence, desegregation was not met with rioting and violence as it had been in other southern institutions such as the universities of both Mississippi and Alabama. Events in Alabama had brought the school to national infamy due to George Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door in June 1963 to protest against desegregation. Despite its relative peaceful nature, though, it would be naive to believe that desegregation was wholly endorsed and was likely met instead with grudging acceptance by many. The institution simply did not want the ridicule and backlash that had befell Alabama. A particularly interesting figure in USC's history during the years following desegregation was Vicky Esslinger, who served in student government and involved herself in a great deal of debate on a variety of issues, including civil rights. The Russell House takeover of May 1970, in which students protested in the main university building about the escalation of the Vietnam War, with the US troops moving into Cambodia for the first time,
was a famous instance of student action during Esslinger's time. While not strictly related to civil rights, this event showed the extent to which students were willing to go in order to voice their opinions. A letter which was written from Vicky to University President Jones in November 1969 was an interesting source in researching her role in issues of race relations at the university. In the letter, she is critical of the lack of support and attendance from the university hierarchy regarding a performance at USC by comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory. And that is a picture of Vicky on the left and Dick Gregory's performance on the right. One particularly interesting excerpt from the letter, which I will read to you now, puts forth her argument. Quote, "What I don't understand is how can an adult tell us to be subject to change, to be open-minded, and to give others a chance to voice their opinions, and then refuse to attend a lecture on something as relevant and pertinent, especially in the South, as civil rights because of social pressure. This kind of hypocrisy does not escape the students. We walk into a history class and learn about a 1964 Civil Rights Act. Then we go into political science classes or pick up daily newspapers and read about the way today's adults, I'm speaking mostly of the SC community, which includes some of our teachers and administrators, are coping with the problems. They condemn student radicals for not following university regulations with which they don't agree. If they look at the Southern reaction to a US Supreme Court ruling concerning school desegregation, can they possibly wonder who taught the students to ignore authority? Do these people with their small opinions have the ability to inhibit the actions of intelligent and well-educated professors and administrators of a state university? These educators should concern themselves with setting examples and trying to help the people in the community rather than bending to social pressures." This could be interpreted again as an example of the student body who attended Gregory's performance in huge numbers being more well-rounded and less inclined to prejudice than the administration. Dick Gregory is himself credited with changing the way in which the white public viewed African American comedy, where it enjoyed huge growth in popularity amongst white audiences. So the fact that the administrators shunned his performance would suggest that underlying racism still existed at USC at this time. The fact that a performer such as Dick Gregory was invited to perform at USC, and also that the event was so well attended by both black and white students, would suggest that the integration process had certainly made strides in the 6 years between the official desegregating of USC and the event itself. I found it extremely interesting to learn about one of the defining moments in the history of the university I've had the pleasure to attend over the past year, and how the university was gradually transformed into the multicultural campus which we see today. Thank you for listening.
My name is Holly Genovese, and I am an MA candidate in history. My paper is titled After Desegregation, the University of South Carolina and the Office of Minority Student Affairs. Although the University of South Carolina formally desegregated in 1963, problems with fully integrating the university were still commonplace in the years after. The long history of both slavery and segregation at the University of South Carolina left traditions and practices in place that made minority students feel uncomfortable and unsafe long after the university was formally integrated. In order to handle these affairs, the Committee on Minority Student Affairs was formed in the early 1970s. While problematic in many regards, this committee was designed to handle specific issues involving minority students and faculty when they occurred. The creation of this committee not only showcased an effort by the administration to combat problems facing minority students, but makes clear that the 1963 desegregation of the university did not cure problems for African American and other minority students at the university. While incredibly important to commemorate the 50th anniversary of desegregation, we must remember that new issues for African Americans were created within the University of South Carolina after desegregation, and the Committee on Minority Student Affairs is a valuable lens from which to explore them. Thomas Jones, a former university president, appointed a committee of both black and white administration, faculty, and student members in January 1971. The stated purpose of the organization was to, quote, keep under review the needs and problems of minority group students, particularly but not limited to black students, and make recommendations to the president, the provost, and the vice president of the university. In actuality, the committee dealt with issues ranging from the playing of Dixie at sporting events to housing discrimination to the institution of programs and opportunities specifically designed for minority students. The Office of Minority Student Affairs was involved in the creation of a Council on Legal Educational Opportunities, which allowed for economically disadvantaged students to gain entrance to the law school. While this program was eventually discontinued because many of the law students did not have the academic preparation necessary to maintain the required GPA, the advent of the program makes evident the recognition of institutional and socioeconomic barriers to success for minority students by the committee. The desegregation of the university allowed African American students to enroll, but did not directly address barriers to entrance from outside the doors of the university. According to the committee, African American students were often from poor neighborhoods with subpar public schools, and while many of these students would be admitted, they faced challenges unknown to many other students. The institution of the CLEO makes clear that the Committee on Minority Student Affairs and the university more broadly was both cognizant of these barriers and made small attempts to rectify the situation. As the failure of the CLEO program shows, attempts to address broader issues for African American students did not always succeed. These institutional barriers to success lasted long after formal desegregation of the university and colored the experience of African American students at the university. As we commemorate the 50th anniversary of desegregation, it is important to continuously question the opportunities truly available to African American students after. Beyond dealing with institutional and socioeconomic barriers to success while enrolled, African American students at the university often had to deal with racism veiled as tradition. On numerous occasions, there was controversy at sporting events about the playing of the song Dixie. There were incidents when the band played Dixie, specifically when Casey Manning, the first African American basketball player at USC, was on the court, and many students found this mocking and offensive. Student supporters of the song claimed that it was an important Southern cultural tradition, while many African American students found it insulting and distracting. Dan Carter, a University of South Carolina student in the early 1960s, recollected that, quote, "The only violence I encountered came at a USC football game in 1961 when 3 members of Kappa Alpha dragged me out of my seat and shoved me down the concrete stairs at the Old Carolina Stadium after I refused to stand for the USC band's rendition of Dixie." The song, end quote. The song Dixie and other USC traditions were often used to antagonize African American students in the 60s and 70s. The Committee on Minority Student Affairs was created to help reconcile these issues for minority students. The Committee on Minority Student Affairs addressed this issue, but because of internal disagreements, they allowed the band to decide how to handle the controversies surrounding the song. The playing of Dixie makes evident that although African American students were allowed to attend the university, the usage of long-standing cultural practices in antagonistic ways still affected the lives of minority students. A university so steeped in traditions of oppression did not immediately eradicate even the most obvious cultural elements of racism, and while many of the systematic barriers for African American and other minority students had decreased after desegregation, the cultural reminders remain and continue to create discomfort and controversy within the university. Throughout the 1970s, the Committee for Minority Student Affairs was also concerned with the hiring of African American professors and the attendance and support at university events and speaker series. Many of these events were poorly attended, especially by white students and faculty. The Commission on Minority Affairs and the university president made a concerted effort to get students and faculty to show support for African American students, making clear the importance of not just integrating the university, but fully engaging African American students and faculty within the university community. The interest in recruiting and giving extra attention to African American faculty became more pronounced throughout the 70s. The Committee on Minority Student Affairs had an interest in both attracting more African American faculty, giving more resources to them. They realized that solely integrating the student body would not effectively change the racial dynamics of the university, and that African American members of the faculty were facing issues as well. While the Committee on Minority Student Affairs was created to handle the issues of minority students, there are many internal disputes within. The handling of issues such as the controversy surrounding Dixie often result in disputes and non-action. Many people, from both inside and outside the committee, criticized it for being all talk and no action. While the committee had many ideas in the first few years of its existence, much of the internal conflicts prevented new policies and interventions to take place. In many ways, these disputes stalled the progress. Further research on the Office of Minority Student Affairs at the University of South Carolina is necessary to fully explore the extent of its influence on the lives of minority students in the years following desegregation. The acknowledgement of forms of institutional racism, problematic traditions, and more direct discrimination showcases both the continued and often failed attempts of the university to serve minority students in the 1970s. The struggles African American students and faculty continued to face in the years after desegregation did not stop, they took a new form. We must not stop our study of desegregation with 1963, but explore the experiences and challenges faced by African American students of the university in the years after. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My project is entitled Peace, Love, Education, and Liberation, the History of the African American Studies Program at the University of South Carolina. The African American Studies Program is an interdisciplinary program established to broaden the university's curricular offerings to include analysis of the social, political, cultural, and historical experience of African Americans and people of African descent around the globe. The program was officially established in 1971 after a 5-year grassroots campaign conducted by student activists within a newly formed organization known as the Association for Afro-American Students, or AAAS. These students sought greater access to educational resources, increased recruitment of their peers, and the inclusion of blacks into the wider university community. Learning from events at other institutions, AAAS leaders work alongside faculty and administrators rather than pursue more militant routes for social change. The end result was the creation of an academic program that, despite lengthy periods of financial strain and limited institutional support, provided students with knowledge of African American history and culture to better prepare them for the world beyond the ivory tower. Student leaders criticized the, quote, misrepresentation and gross ignorance of the true history and culture of black people by white citizens of South Carolina, unquote, and blamed this distorted view for the racial prejudice and injustices endured by African Americans in the state and elsewhere. To honor those who had suffered such indignities, particularly the 3 students killed at South Carolina State College in February of 1968, black students at USC demanded that President Thomas F. Jones and the university administration take immediate action to improve the overall experience of black students at the university and to provide new courses that would allow future students to improve their lives and control their own destinies. They also sought the inclusion of books by black authors on the freshman reading list, increased enrollment of African American students proportional to the state's black population, recruitment of black scholars as full-time professors, access to white-collar and supervisory positions for qualified blacks, and even higher pay for the majority African-American janitorial staff. At the top of the list, however, was the creation of a Black Studies program to be created in consultation with leading academic authorities to fairly and accurately represent the true role of black people in world and American history. Faculty and key administrators, such as Dean of Student Affairs Charles H. Whitten and President Thomas F. Jones, who I mentioned earlier, were apprehensive but largely supportive of the effort. In a letter to AAAS leadership, President Jones lamented the, quote, emotionally charged, unquote, situation, but recognized the value of a Black Studies program. A Black Studies committee was formed, which also included student leaders such as Luther Batiste, who you'll hear more about in the last paper, Dr. Harry Wright, who became a very prominent graduate and continues to serve in the biology department here. And so they continue to visualize the possibilities of this Black Studies program. A final proposal was completed and ratified by the summer of 1970. And afterwards, the committee set out to hire a director with the necessary scholarly and interpersonal skills to navigate the choppy racial waters of the university community. After interviewing several strong candidates, the committee selected Mr. Willie Hereford, a graduate of the University of Kansas and former archivist at both the Truman Presidential Library and the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta. Beginning in September of 1971, Hereford started as a dual appointment with the African American Studies program and assistant dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. Despite his best efforts, the road to respectability for the African American Studies program was a rocky one. Hereford's ability to sell students and parents on the value of a degree in African American Studies was hampered further by the fact that the program was not initially offered as a major because there were far too few faculty available to teach the necessary number of courses. Well into the 1990s, the program struggled to provide a suitable number of course offerings, recruit and retain qualified black professors, and gain respectability within the university's academic community. Credit for the survival and eventual growth of the program should also be given to Dr. Grace Jordan McFadden, who served in a joint position within the Department of History and African American Studies program beginning in 1971. This made her the first African American woman hired and eventually tenured at the professorial rank in the College of Arts and Sciences at USC. Hereford credits Dr. McFadden with the program's success in registering large numbers of students, but despite the limited number of course offerings. And I would also be remiss not to mention her work as the creator of an oral history and culture program here at USC, which has provided a great deal of evidence, which has probably helped a number of our papers today. In 1988, Hereford stepped down and Dr. McFadden became full-time director. She continued the tradition of resourcefulness that had sustained the program through hard times. Following her retirement due to illness in 1993, the program's future was in doubt. In its university-wide review, the Commission of Higher Education actually recommended that the African American Studies program be terminated due to, quote, marginal productivity, unquote. With the program at the crossroads, faculty and key administrators were forced to make a decision, either allow the program to be terminated or provide it with the necessary resources to make it competitive. In conjunction with the university's newfound commitment to diversity, a committee was formed to assess the program's strengths, to determine its needs, and to develop a plan to, quote, build a nationally respected academic department and to provide a richer representation of the experience of African Americans across the disciplines at USC, unquote. The committee reported that budgetary limitations had stunted the program's growth and its ability to function as a full-fledged member of the university community. They pointed out that in the more than 20 years since the program's inception, other departments had more than tripled in size. Connecting the program's growth to the university's stance on diversity, the committee stressed that USC students would be, quote, intellectually, socially, and culturally handicapped, unquote, without a fully funded, active, and inspired African American Studies program. Diplomatic but firm in its demands, the committee essentially requested that the program be integrated into the university community as a fully fledged department. They laid out 8 phases for the program's renewal that would culminate with the commemoration of its 30th anniversary in 2001. After 20 years of struggle and survival, the African American Studies program finally received the support and resources needed to enter the new millennium as a vital component of the university's effort to increase diversity, educate all students on the importance of African American history and culture, and grapple with real-world problems facing blacks today. The program thrived under a string of talented scholars who served as director, including Dr. Cleveland Sellers and current director, Dr. Valinda Littlefield. Several new faculty members were also hired, which enabled the department to meet its high demand for the introductory courses and also put on new ones. The program renewed its long-standing lecture series, known as the Robert Smalls Lecture Series. Beginning in 1997, this series has provided a forum for nationally known scholars to share original research on a wide range of subjects in the field of African American Studies. Among those who have participated include Drs. Andrew Billingsley, Henry Louis Gates, Darlene Clark Hine, and Cornell West. The program has also provided students with financial assistance and scholarships, such as the Grace Jordan McFadden Award, given annually to those who demonstrate academic excellence in the field of African American Studies. Today, the African American Studies program provides USC students with a unique perspective and greatly enriches the university's liberal arts curriculum. After decades of struggle for funding and respect that nearly led to its demise, the program has experienced a renaissance that has positioned it to become not only one of the leading black studies programs in the South, but also the nation. With its newfound base of support, the department is poised to strengthen its efforts to educate USC students and the public on the African American experience and train students to develop critical, informed solutions to contemporary problems. Thank you.
afternoon. I'm Tamara McCray. I'm a senior African American Studies major and Health Promotions minor. And I hope y'all guys can hear me. I'm short. So, okay. And the title of my presentation is Black President Chosen. One milestone evident of desegregation's greatest moments at the University of South Carolina came less than a decade after the second desegregation of 1963, in which the University of South Carolina Student Government Organization elected its first African-American president, Harry Walker, in 1971. Walker, a native of Greenville, South Carolina, is said to have ran for student body president to fight against the tyranny and oppressions of race exclusivity that historically defined the South in America generally. However, one of his more prominent themes was getting student government back to the students through his character and leadership. Several previous leaders had demonstrated a lack of evidence in explaining why their opponents were not qualified for the position. In other words, disqualifying the leadership abilities of another person in order to obtain the position by default, which Walker felt was dominating in the student government here at USC. During his campaign, he provided that if anyone had to disqualify their opponent in order to be qualified, then their character would automatically disqualify them. For Walker, it was all about the students' position and working as a team to benefit the whole body. According to the Gamecock newspaper then, his opponents were Steve Cannon, also a junior and history major, who had served as president of his freshman and sophomore classes. At the time, he was serving as a student senator and was an active member of the Human Relations Committee of the Senate. Janine Smith, a native of Columbia, South Carolina, junior psychology major, had served as sophomore class secretary, a public relations committee member, a former member of the Gamecock staff, and became a member of Delta Zeta. Walker was a native of Greenville, South Carolina, a junior political science major and chairman of the advisory committee of the African American Students Association, but never held any previous experiences within the governmental sector at the university. While Walker was among several experienced candidates, it was ultimately his character that served as the qualifying agent. Walker's campaign initialized with slogans such as, "We are running to win," "I am running as Harry Walker, not against anyone on campus," as he was officially noted as the first black student to run for the presidency. In March 15, 1971 issue of the Gamecock, Walker declared his platform, noting that the overall reason he was running for president was because, from his experience as a student here at the university, most candidates were typically extremely eager about what they could and would do for the students. However, once they were elected, they would use the position to seek personal gain and renege upon their campaign promises. Walker also declared the following as the most important section of his platform. There would be an investigation of student government spending and reevaluation thereof. It is proposed that a periodic report of spending be published in the Gamecock. Student government in the past has been a useless instrument acting contrary to the needs of the students. A restructuring of the organization is needed to make the organization more germane to the students rather than a mechanism of administration dominance. During this interview, as with a lot of others, Walker never focused on any aspects of racial justice or prejudice, only getting student government back to the students. On March 22nd, candidates had the opportunity to speak with students about their campaign and the stance they had upheld for weeks in a private forum given by the Student Government Committee. Some students gave their opinions about the election and the candidates with regards to their motives and qualifications. Charles Beebe, editor-in-chief of the Gamecock, expressed his concerns about the elections as well as each presidential candidate in the article titled Presidential Candidates Analyzed. Examining the campaign process, Beebe noted that most students of the student body were less responsive of the year's campaign. He also pointed out the unwillingness of the candidates to not campaign with the expectation of sliding into office and how it was disappointing to see such actions taking place in the past. As for Walker, being the second candidate he introduced, he stated that he is a black, articulate, and appreciated, and as an additive to the political campaign. Despite the year being his first experience among student government, he had a natural political mind which could be seen through the black students on campus. He expressed that Walker carried the power and willingness to change issues regarding many students' frustrations. However, he felt that most of his politics were not plausible and could not be solved realistically. He believed that Walker's accusations were merely because he was unacquainted with what the student's government program was doing and had done already to assist the student body. Furthermore, contrary to Beebe's approach to Walker as a candidate, columnist John Gash believed he was a candidate of the people. John Gash said that if everybody thought that if we voted for Harry Walker or if Harry Walker became president, then it's just because black students voted for a black president. John Gash says that if that couldn't be true, because if somebody voted for Janine Smith, then Janine Smith, she had short hair, like straight short hair, and everybody think that, okay, all the short hair people would vote for Janine Smith. There was a flyer published in the Gamecock the day of the election on March 24th, 1971, and my thoughts when I saw the flyer at first, I felt that it was both gender and racial. Gender because we see Janine Smith in the clouds who took the love approach. It's almost as if we're saying that, okay, a woman being president is out of this world. But at the same time, it's almost the saying that Harry Walker, he's the runner, he actually had to run the race. He couldn't use any vehicles to actually establish his campaign. In the Friday, March 26, 1971 issue of the Gamecock, Harry L. Walker was announced as the first black student body president of the University of South Carolina. Black President Chosen, the headline of the article in the Gamecock, explained the skeptics of the university having a black president by saying that it would be a snowy day in the spring before the university ever rightfully voted in a black student body president. Ironically, Walker was elected student body president and was able to make his acceptance speech just before the snow started to fall. In a campaign that was expected to become controversial, Walker was able to put his campaign slogan to work, "Let's all get together." In the end, the slogan proved true. The final tally of votes revealed Walker, 2,068 votes, Joe Usery, 807 votes, Steve Smith, 715 votes, and Janine Smith, 223 votes, with a total of 3,820 students having voted that year. Walker won by a landslide. On Wednesday, March 25, 1971, the day after Walker was elected, a statement immediately went out concerning the opinion of Dr. Thomas F. Jones, the university's current president. He highlighted that since the election was completed, several wanted to know what his thoughts were based on there being an African-American president. He weighs in saying perhaps President Walker expressed it best when he said in his pre-election interview, "I am running for president and I happen to be black. Mr. Walker is the president of all the student body and he just happens to be black." Furthermore, a representative from the university, Ernestine Sitton, gave a special report to the Palmetto Post in the summer of 1971. She relives the unusual snowy election day and reiterated Walker's platform in hopes that the student body had elected a suitable president. Walker's plans included appointments of a 10-member cabinet with each member being delegated a particular responsibility of the platform, such as Victoria Esslinger, a member of the cabinet, having been appointed Secretary of Co-ed Affairs. Sitton continues that Walker, being the first African American in the student body's presidency, it was vital that he remembered, quote, "He expects to be quite visible to the public as well as to students. What he does or does not do could have an effect on the future changes of other black students at the university being elected to high positions of the leadership," end quote. Thank you.
Now you understand, I am tired, but I had a wonderful year with these students. And we're going to open it up for a few questions, please. I know somebody's burning with the question, and they're ready. Any questions? Yes.
We all know who El Marion President is, don't we?
Yes. Would you like to? I do, but.
I'll let you, Hayes. No, when he was head of the South Carolina School, also known as Segregation Committee, in the 50s and so forth. The best thing you can say for him is that by having this committee, they sort of were able to keep some of the real extremists out of the state. Although they that he protracted the process of segregation. So I'm looking at it both ways. And on Tom Jones, whom I did interview in 1980 at MIT, I think he got a lot of flack from the state legislature on the conduct of the campus, you know, of radicals on campus from Saul Blatt and others. So they were having a difficult situation to some extent. Maybe you say that's too conservative, but you know, I don't say that Marion Gressler was right. I'm just saying one of the reasons perhaps that South Carolina was able to avoid some of this is the coming together of sort of the powers that be in the state legislature to clamp down on things, which is good and bad depending on how you look at it.
Questions? Yes.
For either the grad students or the undergraduate students, talk a little bit about our archives or what it was like for you to work in the archives. You've all done amazing research, actually. I mean, is there a letter missing you really wish you'd seen? A piece of information, you know, something in the collections. You say, why don't we have President Vestides buy that? You know, he's telling me I should buy it. But, I don't know, perhaps we'll ask the grad students to start off and give the undergraduates a chance to think about it.
Okay, I'll buy it.
No, thank you.
Well, for me, I guess studying students, because the ones that I featured in my slide are the ones that wrote something down, which is very difficult when you are dealing with a student body, at least in the Reconstruction period, that many of them don't have much documentation beyond just a registration form. But even looking at the scores of their tests are very important to see how they were performing as students when they went there, because one of the criticisms that the White Elite had is that not only would they not fill up the school, but they would underperform, and the great antebellum institution of South Carolina College would be destroyed through that. But what scholars have done, and I guess I've entered into this as one of them, is that we are trying to find out, okay, is that true? And so the university's archives, I have to give them a big shout out because they're trying to digitize this stuff and make it more available for people to actually look at. And it actually helped me while I was writing a dissertation and doing this anonymously. But getting that information and trying to read between the lines, I think is critical, particularly for the 19th century period. And so, I mean, there are many letters I wish that were written, but I think that the evidence that they left behind, I think it does a great justice to these individuals who we might never know their full names, but we can read between the lines and see what they were trying to do and perhaps disprove the powers that be at the time.
I thought it was really interesting, in particular, using the Carolina Library. They had a lot of good resources I was able to use, including papers written by other students in the 70s and 80s about these same topics. It's actually quite interesting to look at what other students at USC have done over the years on the issue of desegregation, the issue of civil rights in South Carolina. And so I was able to look at what they've written as well and see that, hey, people before us were writing about this as well. In some sense, in this particular conversation we're having right now, which is the latest page in that history of dialogue here at USC about the school's racial past and present as well. I also found the presidential papers to be very useful because it was interesting to look at how presidents at South Carolina were really forced to negotiate and navigate these racial waters, so to speak. So I thought it was quite useful, and I got a lot of support from the staff here.
Anyone else?
Well, I didn't really have much of an issue for this piece because I was lucky to stumble across information in the African American Studies program. They were pretty good about keeping certain records and things of that nature, old reports and the like. But what I will say is, for my dissertation on student activism in South Carolina, I'm really excited and happy that Carolina has the ability now to electronically save microfilm, because that was a very difficult situation for all of us, I think, as researchers. So being able to actually go in, use the microfilm, save it electronically, that's been a godsend. So thank you to whoever was responsible for that. And what I'll also say is, I think the archives is that different pieces of the puzzle are located in different spots on campus.
Yeah.
And unless you know the questions to ask, you may not be able to get those puzzle pieces when you need them. And so I would like to see more collaboration between the Carroll, Indiana, the government docs group, the modern political collections. A little less sort of separation, a little more collaboration to say to researchers, okay, I've got John McCrae's collection here. Well, I came across this name, Miss Jessica Simpkins. Where can I, find this? So maybe they might have a list of materials that might cross-reference and things of that nature. I mean, because you will need to go to that library to find her papers, in order to put the full puzzle together. So, I mean, I know that's partially on the researcher, but I think the library could, they have material that coincides with one another, and I think they can make that easier for researchers to say, okay, well, this is what we have, and then don't forget this, and this are located across campus. So, I found that to be, kind of a delay.
And some of them did oral interviews as well. Not only did they use the archives, but they went out and produced more materials that will now go to the Carroll, Indiana. And I'm thinking particularly of Ms. McCain.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I spent a lot of time in the Carroll, Indiana library, and I primarily use the Hayes Mizell papers that are archived there. And honestly, I feel like I know a little bit too much about his personal life. But between the Carroll, Indiana library and the oral interviews that I conducted, this primary research was definitely a fun project for me. And I think I appreciate the university for having so many resources and things available for us researchers.
Can I add one other thing? I would also encourage the libraries to make a concerted effort to go out and gather more, because what I'm noticing is that there's a gap in the materials beyond, say, 69 and 70, so where we can see, the transition to where we are today. And so finding people that might have these documents and be willing to share them, I think there must be a real effort to reach out to the community and gather these materials, because that's going to be essential for future scholars to tell these stories, of the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Well,
President Esty, okay, go ahead.
Well, for me, being an undergrad major in African American Studies, my topic was more so not towards the end, but a little bit later towards this time. So it was after second desegregation. So it wasn't for me not finding things, it was me like being honored to actually just put these things in place. You know what I mean? Like the research that I find, somebody else may come back and try to research this. So okay, this is in place, then they'll have access to that.
President Esty.
If I may, Professor Littlefield, just rise. I actually don't have a question, but two very brief comments. And the first is to say that this was a stunning presentation today, and unvarnished from the sentimentality of the day, as we could be allowed to be sentimental today. But take all of that away. No sentimentality. This was outstanding research today, and every one of you, and I heard all of you did an outstanding job, and I praise the faculty mentors as well for this. And it's why I always tell our students when they ask me, what might I study or what's a good major, I start with history, or any major in the College of Arts and Sciences, of course.
I might be the only dean here.
Yes, and I knew that when I said it. When I became president, there were a lot of things I might have read, and people sent me books of congratulations, and I don't know why, but they sent me books on how to be a good leader, or how to dress for success, and I put them all to the side, and I read history. History about the university and the state and the place. And, it's not lost on us that Santayana, the great Spanish-American philosopher, said those who fail to remember history are condemned to repeat it. That's my second comment here under the watchful portrait of Marion Gressett. We better remember history. because we have maybe turned the page on some of the issues, but we're reliving the same issues today. And we don't play Dixie at football games, but we fly that flag a couple of blocks from here, and
Or we make him president of the college of Charleston.
and we have an African American and gender studies program in lots of courses, but try to include LGBT issues and all of that. There are people who want to close that down. So it's so important for so many reasons that you conducted this scholarship. And there are, again, many sentimental moments that we experienced during the entire year, and will continue through tomorrow, and especially tomorrow evening. But this was just great scholarship. And I would hope that we amalgamate the presentations. There's so many others who ought to and would want to read them who couldn't be here today. So bravo to everybody. Thank you so much.
On the heels of what President Paskey just said, when is the publication coming out?
They're working on that. We figure they will probably spend another year. They're still researching and writing. So they'll spend another year, and then we'll go to the USC Press with a proposal.
I knew you were thinking in that direction.
We'll add a couple more essays to plug up some holes, but yes, we will do that.
Excellent.
They've done a lot of work. They've already been working for a year, so one more year will not make any difference. So I say. Yes.
I have no question, but I really want to thank you. I felt as if I was taking a ride through history. And it was just, for those who know me, as I begin to move forward in my chair, I'm really getting more and more captured by the tale that you were telling. And it's very powerful. So do not give up this work. Keep it going. I can't think of another place in the United States where it's going on with such a rigorous amount of work. So I appreciate you and I applaud you. It's wonderful. And thanks to you.
Thank you. One last question? No burning questions? Again, please join me in thanking our presenters and have a good evening.